Okay, folks. So and now what we talked about in chapter 10 is the fact that the economy may not always be at full employment. The economy may find itself below full employment or above full employment. Well, we're not going to bother much with when the economy is above full employment, when the economy is so hot that we say, well, we better do something to cool off the economy. Most of the time, we care about times where the economy is in a recession and we want to get the economy going, not when the economy is, wow, way overheated. You know, it's too good for its own good. So we're gonna cover about this type of a situation. Whoops, this is no good. So here's price level, here is real GDP. And this is the situation where we're interested in, is when the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, which gives us here is the actual GDP, is below full employment GDP or desired GDP or potential GDP. So the full employment GDP is here, is to the right of actual GDP. So this is full employment GDP. And as you can see, we have a recessionary gap. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to close that gap by stimulating aggregate demand. And in particular is going to be the government who's going to try to stimulate aggregate demand, to create more demand for goods and services in order to close that gap. And by stimulating aggregate demand, they're going to shift aggregate demand to the right by creating more demand for goods and services. And as more demand for goods and services goes up, as the demand for goods and services goes up, that means that firms now have to hire people, and that's going to close the gap. We're going to be back at full employment. So we want to be here. So that's going to be the new aggregate demand. And now the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is going to take place at full employment, and we no longer have that recession, and the recessionary gap is gone. And remember, we talked about, well, what can the government do to stimulate aggregate demand from AD to AD prime? And we said that two basic ways is they control spending and they control taxes. So what they can do is they can either raise the spending, raise government spending, stimulus package, okay, or lower taxes on us, okay. Either one of those would stimulate aggregate demand, okay. For now, we're gonna focus on the government stimulating the economy by increasing government spending. So the way they're gonna do it is government spending going up. So here we have government spending G, and here we're going to have government spending G prime, where G prime is greater than G. So government decides to spend more money on what? It doesn't matter on what. On digging ditches, that's going to put people to work. On building more missiles, that's going to put people to work. On doing some project or another, you know, building roads, infrastructure, building a new high-speed train, God knows what, you know. So any increase in government spending is going to stimulate the economy. But mind you, folks, this has to be an increase in the spending. In other words, this was not planned spending. This is a change in spending. In other words, is unexpected spending. So businesses are taken by surprise. Now they realize that this increase in government spending means that they have to produce more goods. They have to produce this new missiles. They have to produce new roads. They have to produce a new train. Well, that means that they were not planning on producing those things. So that means that they have to hire additional workers. They have to come up with new resources to produce those goods because they weren't planning on doing those goods because the government wasn't planning on increasing the government spending. So this unexpected increase in government spending creates an increase in the demand for goods throughout it. It creates an increase in the need for new resources, new people to be put to work. So this comes as a surprise. So new workers have to be hired. That means that aggregate demand for goods and services increases. People are being put to work. Okay. But now, what I want to mention is the following. Let's suppose that the size of the gap here is $5 trillion. Let's say that actual GDP is 10 trillion and desired GDP or full employment GDP is $15 trillion. This means that the size of the recessionary gap is $5 trillion. Does it mean that now the government has to increase the spending by $5 trillion in order to close that $5 trillion gap? And the answer is probably not. No. At least in theory, the answer is definitely not. Definitely not. Why not? Because there is this so-called multiplying effect. We have something called a spending multiplier. And the increase in government spending is going to get multiplied by this multiplier, and that's going to result in a change in the GDP. Now, we know how much the change in GDP has to be. It has to be equal to $5 trillion. So that means that the increase in government spending is going to go through a multiplier, and that's going to have to result in a $5 trillion increase in GDP. So we have that there's an increase in government spending, which is going to get multiplied by the spending multiplier. And that's what we're going to focus on today, the spending multiplier. And that's going to result in a change in the full GDP. So for example, a problem that we might do in this class would be something like this. We know the size of the gap. In other words, we know by how much the GDP needs to go up. Can anybody tell me by how much, in my example, by how much does the GDP need to go? In other words, what do we need this change in GDP to be equal to?
5 trillion.
$5 trillion, right. We are at 10, we need to be at 15. That means that we need to increase the GDP by $5 trillion. So this guy has to change by $5 trillion. Now, we want to know how much does government spending has to increase in order to close that $5 trillion gap. Well, that means that we need to know what the value of this multiplier is. Because if the multiplier is 10, that would mean that a $0.5 trillion increase in the GDP will result into a $5 trillion increase in a $0.5 trillion increase in government spending will result in a $5 trillion increase in the GDP. If the multiplier is 10, if the multiplier is 2, then the increase in government spending would have to be equal to anybody? If the multiplier is 2 and this has to be equal to 5, what would the increase in government spending have to be?
2.5.
2.5, exactly, 2.5. Because 2.5 times 2 equal 5. If the multiplier is 5, what would the increase in government spending have to be to close that gap?
1.
1.0, exactly. So the multiplier is going to determine how much the increase in government spending has to be in order to close the recessionary gap. And you're gonna be given the recessionary gap. It's gonna say, well, full employment GDP is so much and actual GDP is so much. Well, the difference between the two is gonna be the size of the gap. Well, how much does the government has to increase the spending? Well, we need to calculate the multiplier. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna calculate this multiplier, the spending multiplier. And then we're gonna be able to do those type of problems where if we have the multiplier, we will know exactly how much the government has to increase their spending. All right, so let's talk about this spending multiplier. Well, to get the idea of how this spending multiplier works, I'm going to have to bring in a fresh new concept. And this fresh new concept is called MPC. MPC stands for marginal propensity to consume. Well, what is this marginal propensity to consume? Basically, it tells you if your income changes by X amount, by how much your consumption will change. In other words, if you get an extra dollar worth of income, if your income goes up by $1, well, that dollar is going to go someplace, right? And it has only two ways where it can go. If you get an extra dollar's worth of income, a portion of that dollar is going to be what? You tell me, what's going to happen to a portion of that dollar?
It's going to be taxed.
Well, let's after taxes. That's money that goes into your pocket.
You either save it or spend it.
Save it or
Spend it.
spend it, exactly. You got either save it or spending. Absolutely correct. So what this MPC tells you is what proportion of that extra dollar's worth of income you're going to spend. So if the MPC is equal to 0.8, that means that out of that extra dollar's worth of income, your spending is going to go up by
80 cents.
80 cents. And if your spending goes up by 80 cents, what's going to happen to your saving?
Goes up by 20%.
Exactly. So out of that, because think about it, you get an extra dollar. Well, either you spend or you save, or a combination of the two. If you spend the whole dollar, you save nothing. If you spend nothing, you save the whole thing. If you spend 50 cents, you save 50 cents. If you spend 80 cents, you save 20 cents. If you spend 90 cents, you save 10 cents, right? So that dollar has only two ways to go, here or there, or some combination of those two. So marginal propensity to consume tells us how much we spend out of an extra dollar's worth of income. That means that there's got to be another term called does it make sense that if MPC stands for marginal propensity to consume, MPS is equal to marginal propensity to save? So folks, if MPC is equal to 0.8, we spent 80 cents out of an extra dollar, the MPS has got to be equal to,
1.
no.
No.
Two.
If you spend 80 cents out of that extra dollar, how much do you save?
20 cents.
20 cents. So that means that what proportion of that dollar are you saving?
20%.
20% or
0.2.
0.2. You see that? So if the MPS is 0.8, if the MPC, I'm sorry, if the MPC is 0.8, then the MPS has to be equal to 0.2. If you consume 60 cents, how much you save? 40 cents. Exactly. So MPC is equal to 0.6, MPS is equal to 0.4. If you consume 20 cents, that means that you are saving 80 cents. MPC is equal to 0.2, MPS is equal to 0.8. So what does MPC plus MPS equal to?
1.
Exactly. Because they got to come up with that dollar. Save 80 cents, consume 20 cents, consume 20 cents, save 80 cents. All in all, it adds up to $1. So MPC plus MPS is equal to 1. And let me write down the formula for MPC is the change in income, change in consumption. Change in consumption divided by a change in income. How much does your consumption change given there is a change in income? So if income changes by $100, and because you got another $100 in income, your consumption goes up by $80, then the change in consumption is 80, the change in income is 100, 80 divided by 100 is 0.8. Well, if you got $100 worth of income and you spend $80, that means that you saved $20. So your change in saving is $20. And the change in income was $100. That's 20 divided by 100 equals 0.2. So this is 0.8, this is 0.2. If when you get an extra dollar or $100 worth of income and you spend $50, that means your consumption goes up by 50. Out of a change in income of 100, that's 50 divided by 100 is 0.5. So MPC is 0.5. If you spend $50, that means that you saved $50. So your change in saving is $50. The change in income was $100. 50 divided by 100 is 0.5. So you see they have to add up to 1. MPC plus MPS equal 1. Okay. All right, folks. So let's take now a situation where the government wants to stimulate the economy in a positive way. So we are in a recession, we have a recessionary gap, and the government wants to stimulate the economy in a positive way. So what they're going to do is they're going to increase government spending on whatever. Well, in my case, we're going to build a new aircraft carrier, okay? Mind you, this aircraft carrier was not part of the budget. This is new spending. So they are changing the budget. They're amending the budget. They are increasing the government spending. Okay. So this takes everybody by surprise. Nobody was planning on building this new aircraft carrier because this is an increase in government spending that is not expected, was not expected. The economy suddenly went into a recession and government decides, well, let's stimulate the economy. Let's build this extra aircraft carrier because that's going to put people to work. Okay, so let's do and see what happens in the economy when the government decides to increase the spending by building this new aircraft carrier. So they're going to put an order for another aircraft carrier. Okay, I'm going to make an assumption, and I'm using this number only for the reasons of it's easy to work with those type of numbers. I'm going to assume that in the economy, on average, for us as consumers, is that we tend to spend 90 cents out of an extra dollar's worth of income. So the MPC for the economy is equal to 0.9. People spend 90 cents out of each extra dollar's worth of income. Okay, so I'm going to write this down. MPC, is equal to 0.9. Okay. So what we said is that the economy is in a recession. Let's say that we have $20 billion recessionary gap, a $20 billion recessionary gap. In other words, the economy should be at 520, and the economy is actually operating at only $500 billion. So we are below full employment by $20 billion. Okay. And the government comes in and wants to stimulate the economy. So they're going to order a new aircraft carrier. And now I'm going to make a lot of assumptions. You know, first of all, let's say that the aircraft carrier costs $1 billion. Okay, that's not actually the cost of an aircraft carrier. So an aircraft carrier costs quite a bit more. It may be $8-10 billion, not $1 billion. Another assumption that I'm making here is that this aircraft carrier is built instantly. Obviously, aircraft carriers take many, many years to be built. So when people get that money for building the aircraft carrier, they're not going to get the money instantly. They're going to get the money as the aircraft carrier is being
built.
Yeah, is being built. I mean, you know, if somebody puts an order for this machine that is going to take 10 years to be built, they're not going to get the money in advance. Everybody's going to get paid as the machine is being built. So the same with the aircraft carrier. This $1 billion, it wouldn't go into the economy immediately. But in my example, it was going to go immediately because we're building the aircraft carrier just like that. Very, very fast. Okay. So let's start with what's going to happen now. The government spending is going to go up by $1 billion. This money pays for an aircraft carrier, which is being built just like that. We just built this extra aircraft carrier. When we build this extra aircraft carrier that is worth $1 billion, the economy has grown by how much? By how much does the economy grow when we build an extra aircraft carrier worth $1 billion?
Grows by 1 billion.
Exactly, the value of what has been produced. If they had ordered a new Ford Mustang worth $25,000, then the economy would have grown by $25,000, the value of the Ford Mustang. So if the government had ordered another haircut for me, then the economy would have grown by another $20, the value of the haircut. So the economy grows by the value of goods and services that are being produced. And what has happened here, we produced an aircraft carrier. This was not planned. A new aircraft carrier that was worth $1 billion. So the economy grew by $1 billion. Okay, now, question is, who's gonna get this money? Because this $1 billion is real money. It's money that is gonna go into somebody's pocket. So it's not something, someplace in the air. No, this money is real money. And this real money, when it's being spent by the government, is going to go into people's pocket. Whose people's is this money go into?
The workers of
The
the
workers.
Okay, very good. So all the people who are involved in the production of that aircraft carrier, they all gonna get paid. They all gonna get a slice of it. All the workers. But keep in mind this thing. The company, the contractor who got the deal to build this aircraft carrier, were they planning on building that aircraft carrier? No. So they didn't have the resources. They didn't have the labor, the machinery to produce this aircraft carrier. So what do they have to do? They have to hire those resources. They have to hire workers, or they have to give other workers overtime. So all those workers who are being hired, and they're gonna get paid now, all those workers who are doing overtime, and they're getting more pay because they're doing all this overtime. What is that money to them?
So change in their income?
It's a change in their income. Absolutely correct. That's exactly what it is. That's what I wanted to hear. It's a change in income. Don't say it's income. It is income, but not only it's income, but it's a change in income, because folks, if this order had not gone in, they wouldn't have had this income. So now they're getting an additional $1 billion worth of income that they wouldn't have if not for this increase in government spending. So their income went up $1 billion. Whether it's because yesterday they had nothing, they were unemployed, and today they found jobs and they are employed. Whether because yesterday they were making so much and now because they are doing overtime, they're making more. Or maybe the executives, the VPs and the presidents over there, they're getting what? They're getting big bonuses, right? So everybody is getting a slice of this $1 billion. Everybody is going to get a piece. Everybody who was involved in the production. And that means that now their income, the collective income of everybody who got a piece of this money, their income is going to go up by $1 billion. So here we produced $1 billion worth of aircraft carriers. So the GDP, when we produced that machinery, when we produce a product, the value of the product gets added to the GDP, okay? So the GDP goes up by $1 billion. Then we said, well, who gets this money? Well, the people who produced it. What is that money to them? Extra income. So now there's a change in income, and the change in income is equal to $1 billion. Okay. Folks, my question to you, so all those people got an additional $1 billion worth of income. What are they going to do with that money?
Save or spend it?
Exactly. And do we know how much they're going to spend and how much they're going to save?
They're going to consume 0.9 and spend 0.2. I'm sorry, 0.1.
Exactly. So what's going to happen now is the spending for those people is going to go up by $0.9 billion. But here's the thing that I want you to understand. This consumption here of $900 million or $0.9 billion, that's consumption, that's unexpected consumption, because they did not expect this aircraft carrier to be built. There was no plan on the government ordering this aircraft carrier. Therefore, they didn't plan on having this extra income. Therefore, they didn't plan on spending this money. That means that the economy did not expect this increase in consumption of $900 million. So now, suddenly, there's an increase in the quantity demanded of all goods and services of $900 million. In other words, more cars have to be produced, more washer and dryers have to be produced, more refrigerators have to be produced in order to match this increase in consumption. Because businesses did not expect this increase in consumption of $900 million. This is what I want you to understand, that it's unexpected consumption. Therefore, businesses were not planning on producing those goods. And in order for them to be able to produce more cars, more washer and dryers, more refrigerators, what will those businesses have to do in order to be able to produce those extra goods?
Hire
Get
more
more
resources.
workers.
Exactly. You need more workers now. Because you didn't have workers to fulfill those extra orders. So now firms are going back and they are hiring workers. They're putting people to work. And as they're hiring workers and they're putting people to work, now they're able to produce those extra $0.9 billion worth of goods and services. And guess what? Once those $0.9 billion worth of goods and services have been produced, they hire the workers, they produce those goods and services. Once those goods and services have been produced, the economy, the GDP changes. It goes up. How much does it go up by?
$1 billion. $0.9
Not a billion.
$0.9 billion.
$0.9 billion, exactly. The value of what has been produced. And they produced, to match this increase in consumption, they produced $0.9 billion worth of goods and services. Once those goods and services have been produced, now the GDP has grown by the value of the increase in production. So the GDP now goes up by $0.9 billion. And who gets this $0.9 billion worth of money? Because they produce goods and services worth $0.9 billion. Who gets that money? The people who?
Work for who made the products.
Exactly right. The people who produce those goods, they're going to get that money. How much they going to get? $0.9 billion. What is that money to them? Extra income. Is extra income. They wouldn't have had that income if not for this extra consumption. And this extra consumption would not have existed if not for this extra income that they got. And this extra income would not have existed if not for this extra spending on the part of the government. So now income goes up by $0.9 billion. Well, guess what? All those people who got this extra $0.9 billion, what do you think they're going to do with the money? They're going to spend some and they're going to save some. How much they're going to spend? 90% of it. 90%, 0.9 of $0.9 billion is equal to 0.9 times 0.9, $0.81 billion. So now consumption goes up by $0.81 billion. But folks, this increase in consumption is unexpected because it would not have existed if not for those $0.9 billion worth of goods that have been produced, which would not have existed if not for this extra aircraft carrier. So this, again, is an additional $0.8 billion worth of consumption that businesses have to be able to produce. And in order for businesses to produce this $0.81 billion, what will they have to do? They're going to have to go out, find workers, be able to produce those extra $0.81 billion worth of goods and services. So again, more workers are being hired. Stimulates the economy in a positive way. Folks, the consumption increased by $0.81 billion. Once businesses produce those $0.81 billion worth of goods and services, the value of the GDP goes up by how much? $0.81 billion worth of goods and services. So now the GDP, because there have been more goods and services worth $0.81 billion that have been produced, that means that the GDP goes up by $0.81 billion. Who gets the money? The people who produce it. What is that money to them? Extra income. What are they going to do with it? They're going to start spending. How much? 90 cents on a dollar. So this process keeps going and going and going. So here you're going to go like this. The income are going to go up by 0.81. And then their consumption is going to go up by 0.9 times 0.81, 90% of $0.81 billion, approximately $0.72 billion. Once those goods have been produced, that means that the GDP has grown again by how much? By $0.72 billion. And the process keeps on going and going and repeating itself. Okay. Now, what you would notice is this, that initially, the only thing that the government ordered was that new aircraft carrier that was worth $1 billion. So initially, when the government increased the spending by $1 billion, the economy grew by $1 billion. But because it created this extra income, which creates extra consumption, which means that we need to produce more, the economy grows again by $0.9 billion, which creates more income, which creates more consumption, more need for production. So the economy grows again. So the economy grows not just by $1 billion, but the economy grows by 1 billion plus 0.9 plus 0.81 plus 0.72 plus 0.63 plus blah, blah, blah. Well, it's not going to go to infinity, obviously. Okay. As you see, the numbers get smaller and smaller. But if we were to add 1 billion plus 0.9 plus 0.81 plus 0.72 plus 0.63 plus blah, 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 plus blah, 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 plus blah, blah, blah. If we were to add all those multiple increases in the GDP, what would be the final value for the change in the GDP? In other words, if I was to add all of them, what would be the final change in the GDP? And the final change in the GDP in this case would be equal to $10 billion. So initially, the government increases the spending by $1 billion, but GDP doesn't grow just by $1 billion. The GDP grows by $10 billion. So tremendous impact. A small increase in government spending creates a change in the final GDP. In this case, what is the value for the multiplier, where an increase of $1 billion in government spending translates into $10 billion increase in the GDP? What is the value of that spending multiplier?
0.9.
Not 0.9. What number times 1 equals 10?
Oh, 1.
1 times 1 equals 10?
10.
I'm sorry, 1 times 10.
Yeah, 1 times 10. So in this case, the multiplier is equal to 10. 1, the change in government spending, times 10, the value of the spending multiplier, equals 10, the value of the final change in the GDP. Okay, so we have this multiplier equals to 10, but the multiplier can be higher than 10, can be lower than 10, can be any number. So the next question is, well, what do you think that spending multiplier is dependent upon? In other words, what is it a function of? What does it depend upon? Any ideas? So what caused our multiplier equal to 10 and not 5 or not 20?
The MPC.
Exactly. The MPC. The MPC determines the value of the multiplier. Let me give you another example. Well, it's going to be the same example, but I'm going to change this MPC here. And instead of people spending 90 cents out of each extra dollar's worth of income, I'm going to say that people spend 50 cents out of each extra dollar's worth of income. So let's change this guy to 0.5. I'm going to maintain everything exactly the same. The economy is in a recession. The government wants to stimulate the economy. They increase the spending by $1 billion by ordering this extra aircraft carrier. Let's see what happens to the economy. Well, what's going to happen to the GDP is this. Once the aircraft carrier has been built, the value of the GDP will go up by the value of the aircraft carrier, which is $1 billion. So far, everything is the same. GDP goes up by $1 billion, the value of the aircraft carrier. Who gets the money? The people who build it. What is that money to them? Extra income, because if there wasn't this increase in spending, they wouldn't have had this extra $1 billion. So it's extra income of $1 billion. What are they going to do with it? Spend it. How much? Is no longer 0.9. Now it's going to be equal to 0.5 billion. Yep, 0.5 billion. So now firms have to hire workers in order to produce not an additional $900 million worth of goods and services, but only an additional $500 million worth of goods and services. And when those goods and services have been produced, then the GDP grows, but it doesn't grow by 0.9, but it grows by 0.5. Who gets this money? The people who build it. What is this money to them? Increase in income. What are they going to do with it? They're going to start spending. How much? Half of it. Once those goods are produced, the GDP grows again. But it's going to be by 0.25. This money to them is extra income. What are they going to do with it? They're going to spend half of it. So once those goods have been produced, the GDP grows again. Notice that in this case, the economy doesn't grow by 1 plus 0.9 plus 0.81 plus 0.72 plus 0.63, but it grows by 1 plus 0.5 plus 0.25 plus 0.125 plus 0.06, whatever, and so on. So the GDP is not the multiplier is not going to be 10, because the GDP is not going to grow by $10 billion, but the GDP is going to grow by, any ideas? If I was to add 1 plus 0.5 plus 0.25 plus 0.125, how much would that would add to? Well, you wouldn't know unless you know the
Point like 99 something.
No, think about it. Think this. It's 1 plus 0.5. Now we have 1.5, right? Plus 0.25, we have 1.75. Plus 0.125 is 1.875.
So approaching but never reaching 2.
2, exactly. So it's going to approach, yeah, you're absolutely right. So we're going to say that it goes to 2. So the multiplier is equal to 2 in this case. An increase of $1 billion in government spending is going to result into a $2 billion increase in the GDP. So the multiplier must be 2. In the previous case, an increase of $1 billion in government spending results into a $10 billion increase in the GDP. So the multiplier was 10. So obviously, the multiplier is going to be determined by the value of the MPC. The higher the MPC, the higher the multiplier. The lower the MPC, the lower the multiplier. And the formula it's 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. Or like the book likes to give it to you, it's the same as 1 divided by MPS. Either one, it means the same thing. Because 1 minus MPC equals to MPS. So you're writing the same formula. So let's do some problems. Oh, by the way, in the previous problem, I think that I said that the size of the recessionary gap was equal to $20 billion. And when we had that the MPC was equal to 0.9, the multiplier was equal to 10. Was the increase in government spending equal to $1 billion enough to close the gap? Yes or no? No. How much would be enough to close the gap? That $20 billion gap.
$2 billion?
$2 billion, exactly. Because $2 billion times 10 equals $20 billion increase in the GDP. So that's how much we needed the GDP to grow, by $20 billion, from 500 to 520. So we needed the increase to be $20 billion. Well, a $1 billion increase in the government spending would not do it, because the GDP would go only up $10 billion. So if the government had spent $2 billion, then given the multiplier was equal to 10, then that would translate into $20 billion increase in the GDP, and that would close the gap. Okay. So let me give you some MPCs. Can you tell me if MPC is equal to 0.75, what is the spending multiplier equal to? If MPC equals to 0.75, let's calculate the spending multiplier.
4?
Yep, 4. Because it's equal to 1 divided by 1 minus 0.75 equals 1 divided by 0.25, which is equal to 4. Okay. So if the size of the recessionary gap, is $20 billion, our economy is $20 billion below full employment GDP. How much should the government increase the spending, given that we have a spending multiplier equals to 4?
$5 billion.
5 billion, exactly, 5 billion. Because 5 billion times 4 equals $20 billion. Remember, you have the change in government spending times the spending multiplier be equal to the change in the GDP. The change in the GDP is the size of the gap, because you want to increase the GDP by as much as you have the gap. So if the gap is 20 billion, then you want to change it by 20 billion. If the gap is 100 billion, then you want to change it by 100 billion. So however much is the difference between full employment GDP and actual GDP, that's how much you want to increase the GDP by. But you don't have to spend that amount because the amount of spending that the government does is going to get multiplied by the spending multiplier. So if this guy here, if the spending multiplier is equal to 5, let's say, and this guy here is equal to 100, then the government doesn't have to increase the spending by 100 million, it only, or 100 whatever units, but only by 20, because 20 times 5 equals 100. Okay. Now, on Tuesday, tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about, well, in theory, this seems to work fine, and it makes sense, that if we create jobs, if we create income, that in turn creates more consumption. More consumption means that more has to be produced, so more jobs are going to be created. But as more jobs are being created, that creates more income. More income is being created, that creates more consumption. So more has to be produced. So this keeps on going and going and going. Okay. Now, what we're going to talk about tomorrow is this. This value of the MPC, we can actually calculate it. We have empirical evidence to what it is. I mean, you can go into the economy and you can find out an average for people. If they get an extra dollar's worth of income, how much they're going to spend. And in the United States, in the US, and I'm asking you a question, general question like this, what do you think that value is going to be? Is going to be a high or a low value? In other words, if we get an extra dollar's worth of income, are we going to spend a lot or not so much? Do we save a lot or do we spend a lot? Huh? Oh.
We spend a lot.
Exactly, we spend a lot. And we may have a value for MPC equal to 0.95. We spend 95 cents out of extra dollars worth of income. We spend a lot. That would do what to the multiplier? That would make the multiplier high or low?
Lower? Higher?
Yeah, because you have 1 divided by 1 minus 0.95, which is equal to 1 divided by 0.05, which is equal to 20. So you would end up with a multiplier that's equal 20, which would imply that if we're in a recession and the government would increase the spending by $1, then the economy will grow by a factor of $20. It would have a huge impact. But that's not the case. When we look at government spending and we look at the increases in GDP due to an increase, a stimulus package, an increase in government spending, there is some multiplying effect. In other words, the change in GDP is greater than the change in government spending. In other words, there is some multiplying effect, but nowhere near 10 or 20 or even 5. More in the 2, maybe 2 point something. So in reality, the spending multiplier is much less than the theoretical multiplier that we just calculated with the formula 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. Okay, so the question is, well, how come we have this situation where we're predicting one thing, but then you go out into the real world and you find out that things are not exactly how you predicted them. Okay, and we're going to take a look at, well, how come it looks like we're going 3 steps forward, but then we're taking a couple of steps back. Okay, and the reason is, well, you're going to see whenever there's an action, there's going to be a reaction. That's one thing. So government spending may stimulate the economy in a positive way, the increase in government spending, but there's going to be reactions that are going to reduce the consumption in other parts. Okay. So you have spending going up and at the same time spending going down. And also keep in mind that in my example, all those goods that were being produced, they were produced almost instantaneously. The aircraft carrier immediately. All those cars, washer and dryers, the people who build the aircraft carrier, they get their extra money. All those goods were produced instantaneously. And then the people who produced them, they got paid. They wanted to buy more. Those goods were produced instantaneously. So in real life, that's not the case. In real life, this process is a very long process. And what we're interested is, well, what is the impact? What is the impact of government spending on the economy, not 20 years from today or 10 years from today, but 1 year from today or 2 years from today? What is the impact? Well, that means that you're not allowing that summation to go 1 plus 0.9 plus 0.81 plus 0.72 plus blah, 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 blah. You are cutting off that at a certain point and see, well, let's see what happens after 2 years. What is the impact of this increase in government spending? So you're not allowing that process to keep on going. You're just truncating it. Okay. So that means that tomorrow we're gonna finish up chapter 12. So we did chapter 10. We jumped to chapter 12 because what I'm doing here is chapter 12. And tomorrow, if we're doing it with chapter 12, and this is probably the meat and potatoes of test number 2, is this chapter 12. Then next week, I'm gonna do 2 chapters next week. And that's going to be Monday and Tuesday. And Monday is going to be some general talk about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is what the government does to move the economy in the desired direction, what they do with taxes and or spending. Okay. And basically at this point, we already know. And then on Tuesday, I'm going to take a look at 2 different schools of view, economic schools of view about whether there should be government intervention, because there are economists who believe that, yes, if the economy is in a recession, there should be government intervention. And there are economists who are saying, well, if the economy is in a recession, leave the economy alone, because government intervention can cause more harm than good. So it can lead to an unstable economy, all this government intervention. So we're going to talk about those 2 schools of view. But that's fairly simple. It's not very complicated. So right now, my advice is read the chapter once, watch this video, and then tomorrow, if you have any questions, we're going to start the class with your questions, and then we're going to finish up chapter 12. Okay. Questions? Let me see. Everybody got about the paper that the due date is, you can turn it anytime until the last day of class. So until December 10th. We talked about that. There was, oh yeah, there's another thing that hopefully everybody gets it so I don't get inundated with emails. And I knew about this, but I don't know how to handle it, and it doesn't matter. You should not worry about it. You know, if you take the original test and then you take the makeup exam, what Canvas does, for whatever reason, I don't know why, but instead of putting down one grade and then the other grade, they put out one grade and then they do the average of the test and the makeup. Disregard that, because I have access to both first grade and the makeup exam, and I'm only going to take the higher of the 2. So I don't know how to get rid of that thing, but it shouldn't matter for you as long as you know that I have access to both grades and I only take the higher of the two, not the average. So the average you can just disregard.